The afternoon was warm, quiet, and almost too peaceful for a town that usually saw very little excitement. People walked in and out of small shops. A few kids rode their bikes on the sidewalk, and cars moved slowly along the road. Everything felt ordinary. That was exactly why the officer thought nothing unusual would happen when he spotted a person standing beside a parked car near a grocery store. The person looked calm, maybe even a little tired, as if they had just finished a long day. They weren't doing anything suspicious at all. They were simply leaning against the car, checking something on their phone. But the officer had been on patrol for hours, and he was looking for something to break the boredom. When he saw the person by the car, he convinced himself it could be trouble. He didn't think twice about it. He didn't slow down to observe. He didn't try to understand the situation first. He just assumed. He pulled his patrol car to the side of the road, stepped out, and adjusted his belt with the kind of confidence that came from years of feeling in control. To him, this was just another routine check, something that would take 2 minutes. Maybe he would even get a small story to tell his colleagues later as he walked toward the person. He kept a firm tone in his voice. "Hey there, what are you doing here?" he asked, not rude but definitely sharper than needed. The person looked up from their phone with a polite expression. "Just waiting for someone," they replied calmly. Their voice was steady, respectful, and not defensive at all. But the officer wasn't paying attention to the tone. He looked at their simple clothes and quiet behavior and assumed they were just an ordinary civilian with no reason to question his authority. He believed he already understood everything about them just from a single glance. "Can I see some ID?" the officer asked. He didn't explain why. He didn't really have a reason. He was just used to being obeyed without hesitation. The person nodded and reached slowly for their wallet. Their movements were measured, almost too careful, as if they were trained to avoid any misunderstanding. They handed over their identification without a complaint. The officer frowned as he looked at the card. For a moment he felt something odd, something he couldn't quite place, but he pushed the thought away. He told himself he was just imagining things. "So why are you waiting here?" "This isn't a pickup zone," he said, even though it was technically allowed to wait by the sidewalk. It wasn't a problem, but he acted like it was. The person lowered their eyes briefly, not out of guilt, but out of patience. "I'm just waiting for a colleague to arrive." "It won't be long," they said. The officer misread their calmness as compliance. He felt even more certain that he had full control. He didn't notice the way the person observed his actions carefully, nor the quiet confidence they carried. Nothing about them suggested fear or uncertainty. Instead, they seemed like someone who knew exactly how to handle a situation without causing a scene. Around them, few people started paying attention. A couple walking out of the grocery store glanced over. A man unloading groceries into his car paused for a second. No one approached, but the energy around the moment shifted slightly. Something about the way the officer stood and the quiet patience of the person, he questioned, made people curious. The officer continued talking, asking small but unnecessary questions. He kept trying to find something that would make the situation feel more important than it actually was. He wanted a reason to believe his instincts were right, even though deep down he didn't have one. Yet the person stayed calm. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't challenge him. They didn't seem scared. If anything, they seemed a little disappointed in the way things were unfolding, as if they had been through this kind of misunderstanding more times than they cared to remember. The officer noticed that too. But again, he misunderstood. He took their calmness as a sign that they were timid. He believed that staying firm and authoritative would make them nervous enough to answer anything he wanted to ask. "You waiting for someone from around here?" he asked again, even though they had already answered that. "Yes," they replied gently, "and they should be here shortly." The officer sighed loudly, pretending he was the one being patient. He tapped the ID card with his finger, still not returning it. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked. The question wasn't necessary. He had no official reason to ask, but he wanted to know. Maybe he wanted to judge them further, or maybe he simply didn't like that they remained so composed. The person hesitated for a split second, not out of fear, but because they already knew this conversation was heading somewhere it shouldn't. "It's related to federal work," they finally answered. They didn't sound defensive or boastful. They simply said it the same way someone would mention their job title at a casual gathering, but the officer latched onto it immediately. Federal work? Like what? What exactly do you do? His tone became sharper, almost skeptical. He leaned closer as if trying to intimidate them into giving details. The person didn't react. Their calmness stayed the same. Their eyes didn't shift. Their hands stayed relaxed. It's nothing you need to worry about, they said quietly. That should have been a clue. A big one. But the officer brushed it aside. He believed they were trying to hide something. He believed he had the upper hand. He believed this was his moment to show authority. The person finally straightened slightly from their relaxed lean against the car. They didn't step forward or backward. They simply stood a little taller. Their expression didn't change, but something about their posture did. Something subtle but undeniable. They seemed like someone who was done being underestimated. The officer didn't realize what was coming. He didn't notice the shift in energy. He didn't consider the possibility that this calm person might not be ordinary at all, but the people watching could sense it. The air suddenly felt different, as if something important was about to happen. The officer took a slow breath, getting ready to ask even more questions. Still fully convinced this was a simple situation he controlled. He had no idea that within minutes, everything he believed about this encounter and about the person standing before him would completely fall apart. The quiet tension between the officer and the person standing by the car grew slowly, like the calm before a storm. The officer kept asking questions, each one meant to uncover something hidden. He thought the person would crack under pressure, but every answer came calmly, almost politely, and this calmness only made the officer more frustrated. He didn't realize that the very confidence he saw as weakness was actually a shield, a way to handle situations exactly like this. Around them, people continued their day, some glancing over to watch the exchange without knowing the details. A woman pushing a stroller paused, curious. A delivery driver leaned slightly on his truck, observing. Even a group of teenagers sitting on a bench nearby turned their heads subtly. There was something about the officer's presence, his sharp tone, and the person's steady demeanor that drew attention. No one felt threatened, but everyone sensed that this was not going to end like an ordinary street stop. The officer leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly as if trying to assert control without attracting more eyes. Look, I just need to know why you're here. No one just stands around in a public parking spot for no reason. His voice was firm, confident, but a little irritated now. The person looked him directly in the eyes, holding his gaze without fear or hesitation. I understand your concern. I'm simply waiting for a colleague. It won't be long, and I'm not blocking anything. There was no defensiveness, no anger, only patience. The officer could feel the calmness like a weight pushing against his sense of control, and he didn't like it. He expected nervousness, uncertainty, or at least hesitation, but none came. He tapped his fingers on the ID he still held. He wanted a reaction, a sign of nervousness. When none came, he shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, trying to look taller, more imposing. I need to know exactly who you are. Federal work isn't something people just mention casually. The person gave a small nod as if accepting the officer's request without really conceding anything. I understand your position. I assure you I am here on official duties. But I am also happy to cooperate within the proper channels. His voice stayed even and neutral, which annoyed the officer more than anything else. Inside, the officer felt a growing unease. It was subtle at first, a flicker of doubt quickly dismissed. He couldn't believe that someone so ordinary in appearance could have such a composed, almost commanding presence. The more he tried to dig for answers, the more he realized he was getting nothing but polite, controlled replies. Every question he asked seemed to be met with exactly the right level of information. Nothing more, nothing less. It frustrated him, but he refused to show it. The person shifted slightly, glancing around with a small awareness of the surroundings. They weren't distracted or nervous. They were simply noting who was watching, who could help if things escalated, and who might misunderstand the situation. It was careful, calculated observation, completely unnoticed by the officer who believed he was in charge. Minutes passed. and the officer continued to interrogate, feeling the conversation stretch longer than it should. The calmness of the person began to attract attention. People standing near the grocery store started whispering quietly, curious about what was happening. The officer, absorbed in his own authority, didn't notice the subtle crowd forming. No one was being aggressive. But the presence of onlookers added a layer of pressure that the officer ignored. The person finally decided it was time to guide the conversation toward resolution. "Officer, I understand you are doing your job, and I respect that. But I am asking for patience. My colleague will arrive shortly, and everything can be confirmed then. Until that happens, I assure you, I am not a threat, and no law is being broken." The officer frowned, interpreting this as stalling. He decided to step up his approach. He lowered his voice, leaned closer, and said, "I don't have time for games. If you're here for federal work, I need some proof. I can't just take your word for it." Expected resistance, maybe anxiety, or at least a quick explanation. What he didn't expect was the quiet, unwavering confidence in the person's next words. "You will have your confirmation very soon," the person said calmly, almost like a teacher speaking to a student who didn't understand yet. The patience in their voice made it clear that they were used to situations where authority was challenged, and they were skilled at handling it without raising their voice or losing control. The officer started to feel a small panic rising inside him, though he refused to admit it. His confidence was shaken slightly. It's the first time in a long while that someone had met his intensity without bowing or flinching. He could feel a subtle shift in the energy around him. He had believed this would be a quick encounter, something to assert control over, but the calmness, knowledge, and confidence of this person made him feel uncertain. He asked one more time, trying to regain dominance, "Do you have any ID or badge I can see? Something that proves you're who you say you are." The person didn't hesitate. They handed over a small card and said politely, "This will be enough for verification if you follow proper procedure. I'm happy to wait while that happens." The officer glanced at the card, trying to process it quickly. At first, he didn't recognize the authority it represented, but something in the design, the official stamps, the seal, and the language made him pause. He looked back at the person and noticed a subtle confidence that was different from casual composure. There was something professional, precise, and commanding in the way they carried themselves. This was not someone ordinary, not someone who could be underestimated. Suddenly, the officer realized that this stop was no longer routine. The calm, polite, and seemingly ordinary person he had approached was not at all what they appeared to be. His assumptions, his arrogance, and his expectation that he could control the situation were crumbling. He could feel it in the way the person maintained control over the conversation without raising their voice or showing impatience. Around them, small crowds seemed to sense the shift too. A few people stepped a little closer, not to intervene, but to watch. The energy in the air was subtle, but undeniable. Something was about to happen that none of them had expected. The person's calm, polite demeanor remained unchanged. They simply waited, confident that the truth would come out and that the officer would realize that he had misjudged everything. Their patience was a quiet power, stronger than any force or threat. It was clear they had handled situations like this before. They were not about to lose control now. The officer's mind raced. He had never encountered anyone like this. He felt a mixture of frustration, uncertainty, a growing awareness that he had underestimated someone in a way that could cost him dearly. He had thought he was in control, but now he could see the reality. He was not. And whatever was coming next would change everything in a matter of minutes. The tension had reached a point where even the onlookers could feel it. Every person who had paused to watch seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. The officer, though still trying to appear in control, was starting to realize that his confidence might have been misplaced. The calmness of the person before him was not weakness. It was a sign of training experience, an authority that the officer had never anticipated. Suddenly, the person decided it was time to end the guessing. Their voice, calm but firm, carried a quiet weight that made everyone around pay attention. "Officer, I believe this conversation has gone far enough. I am a senior federal agent, and I am on official duty. You are required to follow protocol when verifying my identity. The words hit the officer like a wave. He blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. Senior federal agent. The person he had assumed was ordinary, someone he could handle easily, was far above his authority. The recognition of that fact came slowly, but once it hit, it was immediate and undeniable. He realized that he had underestimated this person in every possible way. Around them, people reacted quietly. Some took a step back, unsure of what they were witnessing. The few who had been watching the interaction closely could feel the shift in energy. The officer's posture changed subtly. His confidence faltered. He had always relied on authority, on the fear or respect it generated, but this person required none of it. The truth was clear. This encounter was no longer in his control. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain composure, but his words came out uncertain. I didn't know. I wasn't aware. He struggled to find the right thing to say, but the person's presence made it impossible to bluff. They didn't raise their voice or make a threat. They simply stood with quiet authority. The person's calm demeanor made it clear they had seen situations like this many times before. They didn't need to assert dominance because their position and training spoke for itself. The officer's attempt at authority now seemed almost laughable, and he could feel it in the subtle shifting of the crowd's attention toward him. You need to follow protocol. The agent continued, still calm, still polite. Your assumptions put both of us at risk. I expect you to handle this professionally as you would any other federal verification. The officer swallowed hard. He felt a mixture of embarrassment and panic. This was not a moment for debate. He realized that his usual tactics, confidence, intimidation, and assumption would not work here. The person had removed the ground beneath his feet without a single aggressive move. He was exposed, not just to the agent, but to the witnesses who had gathered around. Every step he had taken in confidence now felt like misstep. He glanced around to see the reactions of the onlookers. Some were curious, some were shocked, and a few looked concerned. The energy of the crowd reflected the officer's internal state. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, vulnerable, and unprepared. The person he had underestimated had not even raised a hand or spoken harshly. Yet they had completely shifted the situation. I need to verify your credentials immediately, the officer finally said, his voice shaky but trying to regain professionalism. The agent handed over official documentation with a calm hand, showing the proper identification clearly. It was meticulous, flawless, and undeniable. The officer took the papers with a trembling hand, realizing that the moment had completely escaped him. His assumptions, his arrogance, and his expectation of control were gone. The reality of the situation was stark and humbling. The crowd's attention was palpable. People around began whispering softly, exchanging looks of astonishment. The officer felt their judgment, their curiosity, and their expectation of accountability. He had been so focused on what he thought he controlled that he had not noticed how public this encounter had become. Now, the eyes of strangers added pressure to an already intense moment. The agent, still calm and collected, waited patiently as the officer examined the credentials. There was no rush, no demand, just quiet authority. The presence of someone so composed, experienced, and clearly in control made the officer reconsider his own actions. Every moment he had spent underestimating this person now seemed like a mistake, a lesson he would not soon forget. The officer's hands shook slightly as he tried to process everything. He had imagined himself handling this situation with ease, but instead he felt completely out of his depth. The calm demeanor, the professional bearing, and the quiet confidence of the agent were overwhelming. It was a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving and assumptions could lead to serious consequences. Finally, the officer managed to speak, his voice low and uncertain. I apologize. I didn't realize. He stopped, realizing there was nothing more he could say that would fully convey the depth of his misjudgment. The agent nodded slightly, acknowledging the admission without anger. Acknowledging your mistake is the first step. Now, follow the proper procedures, and we can resolve this professionally. The officer nodded, understanding that his actions in the last several minutes had not only exposed his misjudgment, but it also put him at risk professionally. He felt a weight of humility settle over him. The encounter had begun as a routine stop, but it had transformed into a life lesson in respect, awareness, and the danger of underestimating someone based on appearances. The onlookers slowly began to disperse, sensing that the immediate drama had ended, but still feeling the impact of what they had witnessed. The air remained charged with the memory of the encounter, a subtle but lasting impression of authority, professionalism, and the consequences of misjudgment. As the officer returned the credentials and stepped back, he felt the weight of the lesson. He had been underestimating the wrong person, and now he understood that the consequences of his assumptions could have been far worse. The agent's calm, confident, and controlled presence had turned the situation around in a matter of minutes, demonstrating a power that was quiet but undeniable. The encounter was over, but the lesson lingered. The officer had faced a moment that challenged everything he believed about authority, control, and appearances. And the agent, standing calmly beside the car, had shown that true power often came not from force, but from patience, experience, and quiet confidence. The moment after the revelation was quiet but heavy with meaning. The officer stood frozen, holding the credentials in his hands as the reality sank in. He had been so sure of his position, so certain of his control, and now all of it felt fragile. The person he had assumed was ordinary had not only proven their authority, but had done so without any aggression or harsh words. It was a subtle but complete reversal of power around them. A small crowd of bystanders shifted slightly, unsure whether to speak or leave. The tension was tangible, a silent acknowledgement of the unusual encounter. Some people whispered quietly among themselves, trying to process what they had witnessed. A few faces showed admiration for the calm and composed demeanor of the agent, while others seemed amazed at how quickly the officer's confidence had evaporated. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. He had realized his mistake, but admitting it fully was not easy. I didn't understand," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I thought this was routine. I underestimated the situation." The agent nodded, not with anger, but with quiet authority. Underestimation is common, especially when appearances suggest simplicity. It's important to remember that authority does not always come with uniform or title visible at first glance. In this case, your assumptions created risk, but acknowledging it is the right step forward. The officer felt a heavy weight of humility. Every instinct he had relied on, every assumption he had made in the past, now seemed like a dangerous shortcut. He realized that his job was not just about enforcing rules. It was about awareness, respect, and careful judgment. The lesson was clear, and the impact immediate. His confidence had been replaced by reflection and understanding. The agent continued to speak calmly, giving instructions for the verification process. Every action was precise, professional, and deliberate. There was no rush, no frustration, just the efficiency of someone who had seen similar situations many times before. The officer followed the instructions carefully, his hands still slightly trembling, realizing that even small errors could have larger consequences when authority was misjudged around them. The crowd had begun to settle, some people moving on, others lingering a little longer out of curiosity. The air felt charged with the energy of a situation that had shifted dramatically in minutes. What began as a routine check had turned into a lesson in patience, humility, and the importance of not judging someone by appearances. The officer handed the credentials back to the agent, his voice steady but subdued. "I understand now. Thank you for your patience." The agent accepted the papers with a small nod. Patience is essential, but so is respect and caution. Situations like this remind us that every interaction matters, and that underestimating anyone can have consequences far beyond what we expect. The officer exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his body little by little. He had learned a lesson that would not be easily forgotten. It wasn't about punishment or authority. It was about awareness, humility, and the human capacity to misjudge situations. He felt a mix of relief, embarrassment, and gratitude. Understanding the importance of the encounter, the agent finally straightened, signaling that the situation was concluded. There was no confrontation, no harsh words, just quiet authority and professionalism. The officer nodded, stepping back and allowing the agent to move freely. The atmosphere, once tense, began to relax. Onlookers started to disperse, their whispers fading into the background. Some would carry the memory of what they had witnessed for a long time. Recognizing the rare display of calm power and the humbling of someone who thought they were in control, the officer took a moment to reflect privately. He had learned firsthand that confidence could be misleading if it wasn't balanced with awareness and respect. The encounter had lasted only minutes, but the impact was significant. It was a lesson about underestimation, about appearances, and about the true nature of authority. The agent, calm and collected, began to move toward their vehicle, signaling that their duties were to continue elsewhere. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture purposeful, a testament to years of experience and training. The officer watched, understanding that he had witnessed not just authority, but mastery of professionalism and human interaction. He realized that the incident would likely become a story told among colleagues, a cautionary tale about judgment and humility. But for him personally, it was a moment of self-awareness, a reminder that assumptions could quickly backfire and that true competence often came quietly. Without boasting or visible display, the officer adjusted his uniform, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and clarity. The minutes that had seemed routine were in reality a transformative experience. The agent's calm, precise, and unassuming authority had flipped the situation entirely. It was a stark reminder that power and skill were not always visible at first glance. Finally, the officer spoke quietly to himself, almost as if confessing, "I will never underestimate anyone like this again." The words carried weight because they were sincere. The lesson was not abstract. It was immediate, personal, and unforgettable. The agent's figure receded in the distance, moving with purpose, leaving the officer standing beside his patrol car. Now fully aware of how quickly circumstances could change, the street returned to normal, but for the officer, the experience remained vivid, a living reminder of the consequences of assumptions and the quiet strength of true authority. As he resumed his patrol, the officer carried the memory with him. He moved with more caution, more awareness, and a deep respect for the unknown capabilities of the people around him. The encounter, brief as it had been, reshaped his understanding of judgment, professionalism, and humility. It was a lesson delivered in minutes, but one that would influence every decision he made going forward. The encounter was over, but the lessons it left behind were far from complete. The officer walked back to his patrol car, his steps slower than usual, each one weighed down by reflection. The realization that he had underestimated someone so capable, someone so calm and confident, lingered in his mind. He understood now that assumptions could be dangerous, especially when they were made in moments of perceived control. As he settled into his car, he thought about every moment of the interaction, the initial approach, the polite answers, the calm demeanor, and finally, the revelation. Each detail, once taken for granted, now carried a deeper meaning. He realized that his overconfidence had almost cost him respect, credibility, and perhaps more. The brief minutes had been enough to change his perspective completely. The agent had moved on, continuing their day with the quiet authority that had defined the entire encounter. Watching them leave, the officer understood that true power often did not shout. It did not need to display itself aggressively or make threats. Instead, it existed in calmness, precision, and confidence. He had witnessed it firsthand and had been humbled by it. Back in his car, he replayed the encounter in his mind. He recognized the subtle cues he had missed, the steady gaze, the patient tone, the slight adjustments in posture that showed control without arrogance. He realized that appearances could be deceiving. Someone who seemed ordinary could hold authority and skill far beyond what he had imagined. He also thought about the crowd that had gathered. They had seen the officer's confidence falter and the agent's calm authority prevail. He could imagine the whispers, the curiosity, and the amazement in their eyes. The encounter had been public, and while no one had been in danger, the lesson had been clear to all who watched. Never underestimate someone based on looks or assumptions. The officer reflected on how he had approached the situation. He had relied on years of experience, assuming it was enough to judge character and control the encounter. But he now understood that experience without awareness could be misleading. He felt a sense of humility wash over him, mixed with a quiet determination to change. He would not make this mistake again. He thought about how the agent had handled everything. There had been no anger, no condescension, no display of force, just quiet, professional authority. That approach had not only protected the agent, but it also allowed the officer to see the truth without escalation. It was a powerful example of how composure and patience could resolve tense situations better than force or aggression. The officer realized that his job was more than enforcing rules. It was about understanding people, respecting authority in all forms, and maintaining professionalism at all times. The encounter had reminded him that every interaction mattered, and that judgment should be tempered with patience and observation. He felt grateful for the lesson, even though it had come with a sting of embarrassment. He thought about how easily the situation could have gone wrong if either party had reacted differently. A little aggression, a little misstep, and the brief. An encounter could have escalated into something far more serious. Instead, the calm, measured actions of the agent had ensured safety, understanding, and respect. That realization strengthened his respect for those trained to handle high-pressure situations with grace. The officer also considered his own growth from the experience. He knew he would carry the memory of the encounter for a long time, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder to approach every situation with care, humility, and awareness. He understood that assumptions could blind him, and he resolved to be more observant, more patient, and more respectful in future encounters. As the street returned to normal, life around him continued as if nothing had happened. People walked, cars moved slowly along the road, and the town resumed its quiet rhythm. But for the officer, the encounter had left a lasting impact. He had learned that true authority was not about appearances, that respect was earned through composure and professionalism, and that misjudgment could have consequences that reached far beyond a single moment. The agent's figure disappeared around the corner, continuing their day with the quiet purpose that had defined their every action. The officer watched them go, appreciating the calm efficiency and strength they had demonstrated. The lesson he had learned today was rare, and that few encounters would have the same depth and impact. It was a moment he would reflect on often, a memory that would shape his approach to authority, judgment, respect for years to come. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the encounter settle. The embarrassment he felt was softened by understanding and growth. He knew he had been tested, and the test had been passed not by confrontation, but by quiet demonstration of skill and authority. That realization gave him clarity, humility, and a renewed sense of purpose. The officer started his patrol again, moving with a new awareness. Every detail of the streets, every person he approached, every situation he faced would now be considered with patience and care. He carried with him the lesson that had been delivered in minutes, but would last a lifetime. Never underestimate anyone, respect authority in all forms, and approach every interaction with professionalism and understanding. The encounter had ended, but its effects would continue. The officer had faced a moment that challenged his assumptions, humbled his confidence, and reshaped his understanding of human interaction. He had learned that power and skill often came quietly, that patience could be stronger than force, and that respect was earned not through appearance, but through competence, composure, and careful judgment. As the patrol car rolled down the street, the officer felt a quiet satisfaction. He had learned something invaluable, something that would influence every decision he made moving forward. The brief encounter with someone who had been underestimated had transformed his perspective, reminding him that every person, every situation, and every interaction deserved attention, awareness, and respect. It was a lesson delivered in minutes, but one that would guide him for the rest of his career and life.